Harper Audio presents The Active Side of Infinity, a warrior's album of memorable events by Carlos Castaneda, read by Cotter Smith. Introduction. This is a collection of the memorable events in my life. I gathered them following the recommendation of Don Juan Matus, a Yaqui Indian shaman from Mexico, who, as a teacher, endeavored for 13 years to make available to me the cognitive world of the shamans who lived in Mexico in ancient times. Don Juan Matus' suggestion that I gather this collection of memorable events was made as if it were something casual, something that occurred to him on the spur of the moment. That was Don Juan's style of teaching. He veiled the importance of certain maneuvers behind the mundane. He hid, in this fashion, the sting of finality, presenting it as something no different from any of the concerns of everyday life. Don Juan revealed to me as time went by that the shamans of ancient Mexico had conceived of this collection of memorable events as a bona fide device to stir caches of energy that exist within the self. They explained these caches as being composed of energy that originates in the body itself and becomes displaced, pushed out of reach by the circumstances of our daily lives. In this sense, the collection of memorable events was, for Don Juan and the shamans of his lineage, the means for redeploying their unused energy. The prerequisite for this collection was the genuine and all-consuming act of putting together the sum total of one's emotions and realizations without sparing anything. According to Don Juan, the shamans of his lineage were convinced that the collection of memorable events was the vehicle for the emotional and energetic adjustment necessary for venturing, in terms of perception, into the unknown. Don Juan described the total goal of the shamanistic knowledge that he handled as the preparation for facing the definitive journey, the journey that every human being has to take at the end of his life. He said that through their discipline and resolve, shamans were capable of retaining their individual awareness and purpose after death. For them, the vague, idealistic state that modern man calls life after death was a concrete region filled to capacity with practical affairs of a different order than the practical affairs of daily life, yet bearing a similar functional practicality. Don Juan considered that to collect the memorable events in their lives was, for shamans, the preparation for their entrance into that concrete region, which they called the active side of infinity. Don Juan and I were talking one afternoon under his ramada, a loose structure made of thin poles of bamboo. It looked like a roofed porch that was partially shaded from the sun, but that would not provide protection at all from the rain. There were some small, sturdy freight boxes there that served as benches. Their freight brands were faded and appeared to be more ornament than identification. I was sitting on one of them. My back was against the front wall of the house. Don Juan was sitting on another box, leaning against a pole that supported the ramada. I had just driven in a few minutes earlier. It had been a day-long ride in hot, humid weather. I was nervous, fidgety, and sweaty. Don Juan began talking to me as soon as I had comfortably settled down on the box. With a broad smile, he commented that overweight people hardly ever knew how to fight fatness. The smile that played on his lips gave me an inkling that he wasn't being facetious. He was just pointing out to me in a most direct and at the same time indirect way that I was overweight. I became so nervous that I tipped over the freight box on which I was sitting and my back banged very hard against the thin wall of the house. The impact shook the house to its foundations. Don Juan looked at me inquiringly, but instead of asking me if I was all right, he assured me that I had not cracked the house. Then he expansively explained to me that his house was a temporary dwelling for him, that he really lived somewhere else. When I asked him where he really lived, he stared at me. His look was not belligerent. It was rather a firm deterrent to improper questions. I didn't comprehend what he wanted. I was about to ask the same question again, but he stopped me. Questions of that sort are not asked around here, he said firmly. Ask anything you wish about procedures or ideas. Whenever I'm ready to tell you where I live, if ever, I will tell you without your having to ask me. I instantly felt rejected. My face turned red involuntarily. I was definitely offended. Don Juan's explosion of laughter added immensely to my chagrin. Not only had he rejected me, he had insulted me, and then laughed at me. I live here temporarily, he went on, unconcerned with my foul mood, because this is a magical center. In fact, I live here because of you. That statement unraveled me. I couldn't believe it. I thought that he was probably saying that to ease my irritation at being insulted. Do you really live here because of me? I finally asked him, unable to contain my curiosity. Yes, he said evenly. I have to groom you. You are like me. I will repeat to you now what I have already told you. The quest of every Nawal, or leader, in every generation of sorcerers, is to find a new man or woman who, like himself, shows a double energetic structure. I saw this feature in you when we were in the bus depot in Nogales. When I see your energy, I see two balls of luminosity superimposed, one on top of the other. And that feature binds us together. I can't refuse you any more than you can refuse me. His words caused a most strange agitation in me. An instant before I had been angry. Now I wanted to weep. He went on, saying that he wanted to start me off on something shamans called the warrior's way, backed by the strength of the area where he lived, which was the center of very strong emotions and reactions. Warlike people had lived there for thousands of years, soaking the land with their concern with war. He lived at that time in the state of Sonora in northern Mexico, about 100 miles south of the city of Guaymas. I always went there to visit him under the auspices of conducting my fieldwork. When you have absorbed all there is to be absorbed in this area, said Don Juan, I'll move away. I had no grounds to doubt what he was saying, but I couldn't conceive of him as living anywhere else. He was absolutely part of everything that surrounded him. His house, however, seemed indeed to be a temporary dwelling. It was a shack, typical of the Yaqui farmers. It was made out of wattle and daub with a flat thatched roof. It had one big room for eating and sleeping and a roofless kitchen. It's very difficult to deal with overweight people, he said. It seemed to be a non sequitur, but it wasn't. Don Juan was simply going back to the subject he had introduced before I had interrupted him by hitting my back on the wall of his house. A minute ago you hit my house like a demolition ball, he said, shaking his head slowly from side to side. What an impact. An impact worthy of a portly man. I had the uncomfortable feeling that he was talking to me from the point of view of someone who had given up on me. I immediately took on a defensive attitude. He listened, smirking, to my frantic explanations that my weight was normal for my bone structure. That's right, he conceded facetiously, you have big bones. You could probably carry 30 more pounds with great ease, and no one, I assure you, no one would notice. I would not notice. His mocking smile told me that I was definitely pudgy. He asked me then about my health in general, and I went on talking, desperately trying to get out of any further comment about my weight. He changed the subject himself. What's new about your eccentricities and aberrations? He asked with a deadpan expression. I idiotically answered that they were okay. Eccentricities and aberrations was how he labeled my interest in being a collector. At that time I had taken up with renewed zeal, something that I had enjoyed doing all my life. Collecting anything collectible. I collected magazines, stamps, records, World War II paraphernalia such as daggers, military helmets, flags, etc. All I can tell you, Don Juan, about my aberrations is that I'm trying to sell my collections, I said with the air of a martyr who is being forced to do something odious. To be a collector is not such a bad idea, he said, as if he really believed it. The crux of the matter is not the fact that you collect, but what you collect. You collect junk, worthless objects that imprison you as surely as your pet dog does. You can't just up and leave if you have your pet to look after, or if you have to worry about what would happen to your collections if you were not around. I'm seriously looking for buyers, Don Juan. Believe me, I protested. No, don't feel that I'm accusing you of anything, he retorted. In fact, I like your collector's spirit, I just don't like your collections. That's all. I would like, though, to engage your collector's eye. I would like to propose to you a worthwhile collection. Don Juan paused for a long moment. He seemed to be in search of words, or perhaps it was only a dramatic, well-placed hesitation. He looked at me with a deep, penetrating stare. Every warrior, as a matter of duty, collects a special album, he went on. An album that reveals the warrior's personality. An album that attests to the circumstances of his life. Why do you call this a collection, Don Juan? I asked in an argumentative tone, or an album, for that matter. Because it is both, he retorted. But above all, it is like an album of pictures made out of memories. Pictures made out of the recollection of memorable events. Are those memorable events memorable in some specific way? I asked. They are memorable because they have a special significance in one's life, he said. My proposal is that you assemble this album by putting in it the complete account of various events that have had profound significance for you. Every event in my life has had profound significance for me, Don Juan, I said forcefully, and felt instantly the impact of my own pomposity. Not really, he replied, smiling, apparently enjoying my reactions immensely. Not every event in your life has had profound significance for you. There are a few, however, that I would consider likely to have changed things for you, to have illuminated your path. Ordinarily, events that change our path are impersonal affairs, and yet extremely personal. I'm not trying to be difficult, Don Juan, but believe me, everything that has happened to me meets those qualifications, I said, knowing that I was lying. I wanted to apologize, but Don Juan didn't pay attention to me. It was as if I hadn't said a thing. Don't think about this album in terms of banalities or in terms of a trivial rehashing of your life experiences, he said. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and tried to quiet my mind. I was talking to myself frantically about my insoluble problem. I most certainly didn't like to visit Don Juan at all. In his presence, I felt threatened. He verbally accosted me and didn't leave me any room whatsoever to show my worth. I detested losing face every time I opened my mouth. I detested being the fool. But there was another voice inside me, a voice that came from a greater depth, more distant, almost faint. In the midst of my barrages of known dialogue, I heard myself saying that it was too late for me to turn back. But it wasn't really my voice or my thoughts that I was experiencing. It was rather like an unknown voice that said I was too far gone into Don Juan's world, and that I needed him more than I needed air. Say whatever you wish, the voice seemed to say to me, but if you were not the egomaniac that you are, you wouldn't be so chagrined.
The conditions of a solitary bird are 5. The first, that it flies to the highest point. The second, that it does not suffer for company, not even of its own kind. The third, that it aims its beak to the skies. The fourth, that it does not have a definite colour. The fifth, that it sings very softly. Dichos de Luz y Amor by San Juan de la Cruz. Tales of Power by Carlos Castaneda. Part 1. A witness to acts of power. Chapter 1. An appointment with knowledge. I had not seen Don Juan for several months. It was the autumn of 1971. I had the certainty that he was at Don Genaro's house in central Mexico, and made the necessary preparations for a 6 or 7 day drive to visit him. On the second day of my journey, however, on an impulse, I stopped at Don Juan's place in Sonora in the mid-afternoon. I parked my car and walked a short distance to the house. To my surprise, I found him there. "Don Juan, I didn't expect to find you here," I said. He laughed. My surprise seemed to delight him. He was sitting on an empty milk crate by the front door. He appeared to have been waiting for me. There was an air of accomplishment in the ease with which he greeted me. He took off his hat and flourished it in a comical gesture. Then he put it on again and gave me a military salute. He was leaning against the wall, sitting on the crate as if it were a saddle. Sit down, he said, in a jovial tone. Good to see you again. I was going to go all the way to central Mexico for nothing, I said, and then I would have had to drive back to Los Angeles. Finding you here has saved me days and days of driving. Somehow you would have found me, he said, in a mysterious tone. But let's say that you owe me the 6 days that you would have needed to get there. Days which you should use in doing something more interesting than pressing down on the gas pedal of your car. There was something engaging in Don Juan's smile. His warmth was contagious. Where's your writing gear? He asked. I told him that I'd left it in the car. He said that I looked unnatural without it and made me go back and get it. I've finished writing a book, I said. He gave me a long, strange look that produced an itching in the pit of my stomach. It was as if he were pushing my middle section with a soft object. I felt like I was going to get ill, but then he turned his head to the side, and I regained my original feeling of well-being. I wanted to talk about my book, but he made a gesture that indicated that he did not want me to say anything about it. He smiled. His mood was light and charming, and he immediately engaged me in a casual conversation about people and current events. Finally, I managed to steer the conversation onto the topic of my interest. I began by mentioning that I had reviewed my early notes and had realized that he had been giving me a detailed description of the sorcerer's world from the beginning of our association. In light of what he had said to me in those stages, I had begun to question the role of hallucinogenic plants. Why did you make me take those power plants so many times? I asked. He laughed and mumbled very softly. 'Cause you're dumb? I heard him the first time, but I wanted to make sure and pretended I had not understood. I beg your pardon, I asked. You know what I said, he replied and stood up. He tapped me on the head as he walked by me. You're rather slow, he said, and there was no other way to jolt you. So none of that was absolutely necessary, I asked. It was in your case. There are other types of people, however, that do not seem to need them. He stood next to me, staring at the top of the bushes by the left side of his house. Then he sat down again and talked about Eligio, his other apprentice. I think it's probably pronounced Eligio. He said that Eligio had taken psychotropic plants only once since he became his apprentice, and yet he was perhaps even more advanced than I was. To be sensitive is a natural condition of certain people, he said. You are not. But neither am I. In the final analysis, sensitivity matters very little. What's the thing that matters then? I asked. He seemed to search for an appropriate answer. What matters is that a warrior be impeccable, he finally said. But that's only a way of talking, a way of beating around the bush. You've already accomplished some tasks of sorcery, and I believe this is the time to mention the source of everything that matters. So I will say that what matters to a warrior is arriving at the totality of oneself. What is the totality of oneself, Don Juan? I said that I was only going to mention it. There are still a lot of loose ends in your life that you must tie together before we can talk about the totality of oneself. He ended our conversation there. He made a gesture with his hands to signal that he wanted me to stop talking. Apparently there was something or somebody nearby. He tilted his head to the left as if to listen. I could see the whites of his eyes as he focused on the bushes beyond the house to his left. He listened attentively for a few moments and then stood up, came to me and whispered in my ear that we had to leave the house and go for a walk. Is there something wrong? I asked, also in a whisper. No, nothing is wrong, he said. Everything is rather right. He led me into the desert chaparral. We walked for perhaps half an hour and then came to a small circular area free from vegetation. A spot about 12 feet in diameter. where the reddish dirt was packed perfectly flat. There were no signs, however, that machinery had cleared and flattened the area. Don Juan sat down in the centre of it, facing the southeast. He pointed to a place about 5 feet away from him and asked me to sit there, facing him. Pause. What are we going to do here? I asked. We have an appointment for tonight, he replied. He scanned the surroundings with a quick glance, turning around on his seat until he was again facing the southeast. His movements had alarmed me. I asked him who we had the appointment with. With knowledge, he said. Let's say that knowledge is prowling around here. He did not let me hook onto that cryptic answer. He quickly changed the subject and in a jovial tone, he urged me to be natural, that is, to take notes and talk, as we would have done at his house. What was most pressing on my mind at that moment was the vivid sensation I had had 6 months before of talking to a coyote. That event meant to me that for the first time I had been capable of visualizing or apprehending, through my senses and in sober consciousness, the sorcerer's description of the world. A description in which communicating with animals through speech was a matter of course. We're not going to engage ourselves in dwelling on any experience of that nature, Don Juan said upon hearing my question. It is not advisable for you to indulge in focusing your attention on past events. We may touch on them, but only in reference. Why is that so, Don Juan? You don't have enough personal power yet to seek the sorcerer's explanation. Then there is a sorcerer's explanation. Certainly, sorcerers are men. We're creatures of thought. We seek clarifications. I was under the impression that my great flaw was to seek explanations. No, your flaw is to seek convenient explanations. Explanations that fit you and your world. What I object to is your reasonableness. The sorcerer explains things in his world too, but he's not as stiff as you. How can I arrive at the sorcerer's explanation? By accumulating personal power. Personal power will make you slide with great ease into the sorcerer's explanation. The explanation is not what you would call an explanation. Nevertheless, it makes the world and its mysteries, if not clear, at least less awesome. That should be the essence of an explanation. But that is not what you seek. You're after the reflection of your ideas. I lost my momentum to ask questions, but his smile urged me to keep on talking. Another issue of great importance to me was his friend Don Genaro and the extraordinary effect that his actions had had on me. Every time I'd come into contact with him, I'd experienced the most outlandish sensory distortions. Don Juan laughed when I voiced my question. Genaro is stupendous, he said, but for the time being, there is no sense in talking about him or about what he does to you. Again, you don't have enough personal power to unravel that topic. Wait until you have it and then we'll talk. What if I never have it? If you never have it, we'll never talk. At the rate I'm going, will I ever have enough of it? I asked. That's up to you, he replied. I've given you all the information necessary. Now it's your responsibility to gain enough personal power to tip the scales. We're talking metaphors, I said. Give it to me straight. Tell me exactly what I should do. If you have already told me, let's say that I've forgotten it. Don Juan chuckled and lay down, putting his arms behind his head. You know exactly what you need, he said. I told him that sometimes I thought I knew, but that most of the time I had no self-confidence. I'm afraid that you are confusing issues, he said. The self-confidence of the warrior is not the self-confidence of the average man. The average man seeks certainty in the eyes of the onlooker and calls that self-confidence. The warrior seeks impeccability in his own eyes and calls that humbleness. The average man is hooked to his fellow men, while the warrior is hooked only to himself. Perhaps you are chasing rainbows. You're after the self-confidence of the average man, when you should be after the humbleness of a warrior. The difference between the two is remarkable. Self-confidence entails knowing something for sure. Humbleness entails being impeccable in one's actions and feelings. I've been trying to live in accordance with your suggestions, I said. I may not be the best, but I'm the best of myself. Is that impeccability? No, you must do better than that. You must push yourself beyond your limits all the time. But that would be insane, Don Juan. No one can do that. There are lots of things you do now which would have seemed insane to you 10 years ago. Those things themselves did not change, but your idea of yourself changed. What was impossible before is perfectly possible now, and perhaps your total success in changing yourself is only a matter of time. In this affair, the only possible course that a warrior has is to act consistently and without reservations. You know enough of the warrior's way to act accordingly. But your old habits and routines stand in your way. I understood what he meant. Do you think that writing is one of the old habits I should change? I asked. Should I destroy my new manuscript? He did not answer. He stood up and turned to look at the edge of the chaparral. I told him that I'd received letters from various people telling me that it was wrong to write about my apprenticeship. They had cited as a precedent that the masters of Eastern esoteric doctrines demanded absolute secrecy about their teachings. Perhaps those masters are just indulging in being masters, Don Juan said without looking at me. I'm not a master, I'm only a warrior, so I really don't know what a master feels like. But maybe I'm revealing things I shouldn't, Don Juan. It doesn't matter what one reveals or what one keeps to oneself, he said. Everything we do, everything we are, rests on our personal power. If we have enough of it, one word uttered to us might be sufficient to change the course of our lives. But if we don't have enough personal power, the most magnificent piece of wisdom can be revealed to us, and that revelation won't make a damn bit of difference. He then lowered his voice as if he were disclosing a confidential matter to me. I'm going to utter perhaps the greatest piece of knowledge anyone can voice, he said. Let me see what you can do. Do you know that at this very moment you are surrounded by eternity? And do you know that you can use that eternity if you so desire?
For years, I had treated the idea of stopping the world as a cryptic metaphor that really didn't mean anything. It was only during an informal conversation that took place towards the end of my apprenticeship that I came to fully realize its scope and importance as one of the main propositions of Don Juan's knowledge. Don Juan and I had been talking about different things in a relaxed and unstructured manner. I told him about a friend of mine and his dilemma with his 9-year-old son. The child, who'd been living with the mother for the past 4 years, was then living with my friend, and the problem was what to do with him. According to my friend, the child was a misfit in school. He lacked concentration and wasn't interested in anything. He was given to tantrums, disruptive behavior, and to running away from home. "Your friend certainly does have a problem," Don Juan said, laughing. I wanted to keep on telling him all the terrible things the child had done, but he interrupted me. "There's no need to say any more about that poor little boy," he said. There's no need for you or for me to regard his actions in our thoughts one way or another. His manner was abrupt, and his tone was firm. But then, he smiled. What can my friend do? I asked. The worst thing he could do is to force the child to agree with him, Don Juan said. What do you mean? I mean that child shouldn't be spanked or scared by his father when he doesn't behave the way he wants him to. How can he teach him anything if he isn't firm with him? Your friend should let someone else spank the child. He can't let anyone else touch his little boy, I said, surprised at his suggestion. Don Juan seemed to enjoy my reaction and giggled. Your friend is not a warrior, he said. If he were, he would know that the worst thing one can do is to confront human beings bluntly. What does a warrior do, Don Juan? A warrior proceeds strategically. I still don't understand what you mean. I mean that if your friend were a warrior, he would help his child to stop the world. How can my friend do that? He would need personal power. He would need to be a sorcerer. But he isn't. In that case, he must use ordinary means to help his son to change his idea of the world. It's not stopping the world, but it'll work just the same. I asked him to explain his statements. If I were your friend, Don Juan said, I would start by hiring someone to spank the little guy. I would go to Skid Row and hire the worst-looking man I could find. To scare a little boy? Not just to scare a little boy, you fool. That little fellow must be stopped, and being beaten by his father won't do it. If one wants to stop our fellow men, one must always be outside the circle that presses them. That way, one can always direct the pressure. The idea was preposterous, but somehow it was appealing to me. Don Juan was resting his chin on his left palm. His left arm was propped against his chest on a wooden box that served as a low table. His eyes were closed, but his eyeballs moved. I felt he was looking at me through his eyelids. The thought scared me. Tell me more about what my friend should do with his little boy, I said. Tell him to go to Skid Row, and very carefully select an ugly-looking derelict, he went on. Tell him to get a young one who still has some strength left in him. Don Juan then delineated a strange strategy. I was to instruct my friend to have the man follow him, or wait for him at a place where he would go with his son. The man, in response to a prearranged cue to be given after any objectionable behavior on the part of the child, was supposed to leap from a hiding place, pick the child up, and spank the living daylights out of him. After the man scares him, your friend must help the little boy regain his confidence in any way he can. If he follows this procedure 3 or 4 times, I assure you that that child will feel differently towards everything. He will change his idea of the world. What if the fright injures him? Fright never injures anyone. What injures the spirit is having someone always on your back, beating you, telling you what to do and what not to do. When that boy is more contained, you must tell your friend to do one last thing for him. He must find some way to get to a dead child, perhaps in a hospital or at the office of a doctor. He must take his son there and show the dead child to him. He must let him touch the corpse once with his left hand on any place except the corpse's belly. After the boy does that, he'll be renewed. The world will never be the same for him. I realized then that throughout the years of our association, Don Juan had been employing with me, although on a different scale, the same tactics he was suggesting my friend should use with his son. I asked him about it. He said that he'd been trying all along to teach me how to stop the world. "You haven't yet," he said, smiling. "Nothing seems to work, because you're very stubborn. If you were less stubborn, however, by now, you probably have stopped the world with any of the techniques I've taught you." "What techniques, Don Juan?" "Everything I have told you to do was a technique for stopping the world." A few months after that conversation, Don Juan accomplished what he had set out to do, to teach me to stop the world. That monumental event in my life compelled me to re-examine in detail my work of 10 years. It became evident to me that my original assumption about the role of psychotropic plants was erroneous. They weren't the essential feature of the sorcerer's description of the world, but were only an aid to cement, so to speak, parts of the description which I'd been incapable of perceiving otherwise. My insistence on holding on to my standard version of reality rendered me almost deaf and blind to Don Juan's aims. Therefore, it was simply my lack of sensitivity which had fostered their use. In reviewing the totality of my field notes, I became aware that Don Juan had given me the bulk of the new description at the very beginning of our association, in what he called techniques for stopping the world. I had discarded those parts of my field notes in my earlier works, because they didn't pertain to the use of psychotropic plants. I've now rightfully reinstated them in the total scope of Don Juan's teachings, and they comprise the first 17 chapters of this work. The last 3 chapters are the field notes covering the events that culminated in my stopping the world. In summing up, I can say that when I began the apprenticeship, there was another reality. That is to say, there was a sorcery description of the world, which I didn't know. Don Juan, as a sorcerer and a teacher, taught me that description. The 10-year apprenticeship I've undergone consisted, therefore, in setting up that unknown reality by unfolding its description, adding increasingly more complex parts as I went along. The termination of the apprenticeship meant that I had learned a new description of the world in a convincing and authentic manner, and thus I'd become capable of eliciting a new perception of the world, which matched its new description. In other words, I had gained membership. Don Juan stated that in order to arrive at seeing, one first had to stop the world. Stopping the world was indeed an appropriate rendition of certain states of awareness in which the reality of everyday life is altered because the flow of interpretation, which ordinarily runs uninterruptedly, has been stopped by a set of circumstances alien to that flow. In my case, the set of circumstances alien to my normal flow of interpretations was the sorcery description of the world. Don Juan's precondition for stopping the world was that one had to be convinced. In other words, one had to learn the new description in a total sense, for the purpose of pitting it against the old one, and in that way break the dogmatic certainty which we all share that the validity of our perceptions or our reality of the world is not to be questioned. After stopping the world, the next step was seeing. By that, Don Juan meant what I would like to categorize as responding to the perceptual solicitations of a world outside the description we have learned to call reality. My contention is that all these steps can only be understood in terms of the description to which they belong. And since it was a description that he endeavored to give me from the beginning, I must then let his teachings be the only source of entrance into it. Thus, I have left Don Juan's words to speak for themselves. Carlos Castaneda, 1972. Journey to Istlan. The Lessons of Don Juan. Part 1. Stopping the World. 1. Reaffirmations from the world around us. I understand you know a great deal about plants, sir, I said to the old Indian in front of me. A friend of mine had just put us in contact and left the room, and we had introduced ourselves to each other. The old man had told me that his name was Juan Matus. Did your friend tell you that? He asked casually. Yes, he did. I pick plants. Or rather, they let me pick them, he said softly. We were in the waiting room of a bus depot in Arizona. I asked him in very formal Spanish if he would allow me to question him. I said, "Would the gentleman, caballero, permit me to ask some questions?" Caballero, which is derived from the word caballo, or horse, originally meant horseman or a nobleman on horseback. He looked at me inquisitively. "I'm a horseman without a horse," he said with a big smile. And then he added, "I've told you that my name is Juan Matus." I liked his smile. I thought that, obviously, he was a man that could appreciate directness, and I decided to boldly tackle him with a request. I told him I was interested in collecting and studying medicinal plants. I said that my special interest was the uses of the hallucinogenic cactus, peyote, which I had studied at length at the university in Los Angeles. I thought that my presentation was very serious. I was very contained and sounded perfectly credible to myself. The old man shook his head slowly, and I, encouraged by his silence, added that it would no doubt be profitable for us to get together and talk about peyote. It was at that moment that he lifted his head and looked me squarely in the eyes. It was a formidable look. Yet it wasn't menacing or awesome in any way. It was a look that went through me. I became tongue-tied at once and couldn't continue with the harangues about myself. That was the end of our meeting. Yet he left on a note of hope. He said that perhaps I could visit him at his house someday. It would be difficult to assess the impact of Don Juan's look if my inventory of experience is not somehow brought to bear on the uniqueness of that event. When I began to study anthropology and thus met Don Juan, I was already an expert in getting around. I had left my home years before, and that meant in my evaluation that I was capable of taking care of myself. Whenever I was rebuffed, I could usually cajole my way in or make concessions, argue, get angry, or, if nothing succeeded, I would whine or complain. In other words, there was always something I knew I could do under the circumstances, and never in my life had any human being stopped my momentum so swiftly and so definitely as Don Juan did that afternoon. But it wasn't only a matter of being silenced. There had been times when I'd been unable to say a word to my opponent because of some inherent respect I felt for him. Still, my anger or frustration was manifested in my thoughts. Don Juan's look, however, numbed me to the point that I couldn't think coherently. I became thoroughly intrigued with that stupendous look and decided to search for him. I prepared myself for 6 months after that first meeting, reading up on the uses of peyote among the American Indians, especially about the peyote cult of the Indians of the Plains. I became acquainted with every work available, and when I felt I was ready, I went back to Arizona. Saturday, December 17th, 1960. I found his house after making long and taxing inquiries among the local Indians. It was early afternoon when I arrived and parked in front of it. I saw him sitting on a wooden milk crate. He seemed to recognize me and greeted me as I got out of my car. We exchanged social courtesies for a while, and then, in plain terms, I confessed that I'd been very devious with him the first time we'd met. I'd boasted that I knew a great deal about peyote, when in reality I knew nothing about it. He stared at me. His eyes were very kind. I told him that for 6 months I'd been reading to prepare myself for our meeting, and that this time I really knew a great deal more. He laughed. Obviously, there was something in my statement which was funny to him. He was laughing at me, and I felt a bit confused and offended. He apparently noticed my discomfort and assured me that, although I had had good intentions, there was really no way to prepare myself for our meeting. I wondered if it would have been proper to ask whether that statement had any hidden meaning, but I didn't. Yet, he seemed to be attuned to my feelings, and proceeded to explain what he had meant. He said that my endeavors reminded him of a story about some people a certain king had persecuted and killed once upon a time. He said that in the story, the persecuted people were indistinguishable from their persecutors, except that they insisted on pronouncing certain words in a peculiar manner proper only to them. That flaw, of course, was the giveaway. The king posted roadblocks at critical points where an official would ask every man passing by to pronounce a key word. Those who could pronounce it the way the king pronounced it would live, but those who couldn't were immediately put to death. The point of the story was that one day a young man decided to prepare himself for passing the roadblock by learning to pronounce the test word just as the king liked it. Don Juan said with a broad smile that in fact it took the young man 6 months to master such a pronunciation. And then came the day of the great test. The young man very confidently came upon the roadblock and waited for the official to ask him to pronounce the word. At that point, Don Juan very dramatically stopped his recounting and looked at me. His pause was very studied and seemed a bit corny to me, but I played along. I'd heard the theme of the story before. It had to do with Jews in Germany, and the way one could tell who was a Jew by the way they pronounced certain words. I also knew the punchline. The young man was going to get caught because the official had forgotten the key word and asked him to pronounce another word, which was very similar, but which the young man had not learned to say correctly. Don Juan seemed to be waiting for me to ask what happened, so I did. "What happened to him?" I asked, trying to sound naive and interested in the story. "The young man, who was truly foxy," he said, "realized that the official had forgotten the key word, and before the man could say anything else, he confessed that he had prepared himself for 6 months." He made another pause and looked at me with a mischievous glint in his eyes. This time, he had turned the tables on me. The young man's confession was a new element, and I no longer knew how the story would end. "Well, what happened then?" I asked, truly interested. "The young man was killed instantly, of course," he said, and broke into a roaring laughter. I liked very much the way he'd entrapped my interest. Above all, I liked the way he had linked that story to my own case. In fact, he seemed to have constructed it to fit me. He was making fun of me in a very subtle and artistic manner. I laughed with him. Afterwards, I told him that no matter how stupid I sounded, I was really interested in learning something about plants. "I like to walk a great deal," he said. I thought he was deliberately changing the topic of conversation to avoid answering me. I didn't want to antagonize him with my insistence. He asked me if I wanted to go with him on a short hike in the desert. I eagerly told him that I would love to walk in the desert. "This is no picnic," he said in a tone of warning. I told him that I wanted very seriously to work with him. I said that I needed information, any kind of information, on the uses of medicinal herbs, and that I was willing to pay him for his time and effort. You'll be working for me, I said, and I'll pay you wages. How much would you pay me? He asked. I detected a note of greed in his voice. Whatever you think is appropriate, I said. Pay me for my time with your time, he said. I thought he was a most peculiar fellow. I told him I didn't understand what he meant. He replied that there was nothing to say about plants. Thus, to take my money would be unthinkable for him. He looked at me piercingly. What are you doing in your pocket? He asked, frowning. Are you playing with your wanger? He was referring to my taking notes on a minute pad inside the enormous pockets of my windbreaker. When I told him what I was doing, he laughed heartily. I said that I didn't want to disturb him by writing in front of him. If you want to write, write, he said. You don't disturb me. We hiked in the surrounding desert until it was almost dark. He didn't show me any plants, nor did he talk about them at all. We stopped for a moment to rest by some large bushes. Plants are very peculiar things, he said, without looking at me. They are alive, and they feel. At the very moment he made that statement, a strong gust of wind shook the desert chaparral around us. The bushes made a rattling noise. Do you hear that? He asked me, putting his right hand to his ear as if he were aiding his hearing. The leaves and the wind are agreeing with me. I laughed. The friend who had put us in contact had already told me to watch out because the old man was very eccentric. I thought the agreement with the leaves was one of his eccentricities. We walked for a while longer, but he still didn't show me any plants, nor did he pick any of them. He simply breezed through the bushes, touching them gently. Then he came to a halt and sat down on a rock and told me to rest and look around. I insisted on talking. Once more, I let him know that I wanted very much to learn about plants, especially peyote. I pleaded with him to become my informant in exchange for some sort of monetary reward. You don't have to pay me, he said. You can ask me anything you want. I'll tell you what I know, and then I'll tell you what to do with it. He asked me if I agreed with the arrangement. I was delighted. Then he added a cryptic statement. Perhaps there's nothing to learn about plants, because there's nothing to say about them. I didn't understand what he'd said, or what he'd meant by it. What did you say? I asked. He repeated the statement 3 times, and then the whole area was shaken by the roar of an Air Force jet flying low. There! The world has just agreed with me, he said, putting his left hand to his ear. I found him very amusing. His laughter was contagious. Are you from Arizona, Don Juan? I asked, in an effort to keep the conversation centered around his being my informant. He looked at me and nodded affirmatively. His eyes seemed to be tired. I could see the white underneath his pupils. Were you born in this locality? He nodded his head again, without answering me. It seemed to be an affirmative gesture, but it also seemed to be the nervous headshake of a person who's thinking. And where are you from, yourself? He asked. I come from South America, I said. That's a big place. Do you come from all of it? His eyes were piercing again as he looked at me. I began to explain the circumstances of my birth, but he interrupted me. We're alike in this respect, he said. I live here now, but I'm really a Yaqui from Sonora. Is that so? I myself come from... He didn't let me finish. I know, he said. You are who you are, from wherever you are, as I am a Yaqui from Sonora. His eyes were very shiny, and his laughter was strangely unsettling. He made me feel as if he'd caught me in a lie. I experienced a peculiar sensation of guilt. I had the feeling he knew something I didn't know, or didn't want to tell. My strange embarrassment grew. He must have noticed it, for he stood up and asked me if I wanted to go eat in a restaurant in town. Walking back to his home and then driving into town made me feel better, but I wasn't quite relaxed. I somehow felt threatened, although I couldn't pinpoint the reason. I wanted to buy him some beer in the restaurant. He said that he never drank, not even beer. I laughed to myself. I didn't believe him. The friend who had put us in contact had told me that the old man was plastered out of his mind most of the time. I really didn't mind if he was lying to me about not drinking. I liked him. There was something very soothing about his person. I must have had a look of doubt on my face, for he then went on to explain that he used to drink in his youth, but that one day he simply dropped it. People hardly ever realize that we can cut anything from our lives, anytime, just like that. He snapped his fingers. Do you think that one can stop smoking or drinking that easily? I asked. Sure, he said, with great conviction. Smoking and drinking are nothing. Nothing at all, if we want to drop them. At that very moment, the water that was boiling in the coffee percolator made a loud perking sound. Hear that? Don Juan exclaimed with a shine in his eyes. The boiling water agrees with me. Then he added after a pause, a man can get agreements from everything around him. At that crucial instant, the coffee percolator made a truly obscene gurgling sound. He looked at the percolator and softly said, "Thank you," nodded his head, and then broke into a roaring laughter. I was taken aback. His laughter was a bit too loud, but I was genuinely amused by it all. My first real session with my informant ended then. He said goodbye at the door of the restaurant. I told him I had to visit some friends and that I would like to see him again at the end of the following week. When will you be home? I asked. He scrutinized me. Whenever you come, he replied. I don't know exactly when I can come. Just come then, and don't worry. What if you're not in? I'll be there, he said, smiling, and walked away. I ran after him and asked him if he would mind my bringing a camera with me to take pictures of him in his house. That's out of the question, he said, with a frown. How about a tape recorder? Would you mind that? I'm afraid there's no possibility of that either. I became annoyed and began to fret. I said I saw no logical reason for his refusal. Don Juan shook his head negatively. Forget it, he said forcefully, and if you still want to see me, don't ever mention it again. I staged a weak final complaint. I said that pictures and recordings were indispensable to my work. He said that there was only one thing which was indispensable for anything we did. He called it the spirit. One can't do without the spirit, he said, and you don't have it. Worry about that, and not about pictures. What do you... He interrupted me with a movement of his hand and walked backwards a few steps. Be sure to come back, he said softly, and waved goodbye.